The Buddha and the Fires. This is a quotation from Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. Full fathom 5 thy father lies. Those are pearls that were his eyes. For he has suffered a sea change into something rich and strange. I love that word, suffered. He has experienced a sea change into something rich and strange. Strange, exotic, otherworldly, different. When I hear stories about the fires that occurred in Santa Rosa in October of 2017, when I hear people talking about how they were evacuated, I'm always curious to know, what did they choose to take? What did they leave behind? Several years ago, my friend Patricia, who is a sound healer, had a garage sale, a yard sale. Now, I don't usually go to yard sales because why would I want to buy someone else's stuff when I had so much of my own? But she had a gong for sale, and I thought I might like to buy it. But I didn't buy the gong because she had this beautiful seated statue of the Buddha. I said to her, "Why are you selling it?" And she told me she had another one, almost the same, but even better. So I bought the statue and I took it home, and I had to sheepishly explain to my husband George that yes, I had bought something in the yard sale. Well, a few months later, she had another yard sale, and I felt compelled to go to that. And there I found another Buddha statue. This was a head of a Buddha. And it was beautiful, but the Buddha had a very fierce expression. And I put this in my studio. And then the following summer for my birthday, Patricia gave me another Buddha statue. But this was beautiful, just the face of the Buddha. And it could be inside or outside, and so I put it in the backyard. It had a gentle quality about it, almost feminine. Early in the morning of October the 9th, I, like so many other people in Sonoma County, woke up to strong winds and the smell of smoke. I got up and I went to the front deck and I looked out, and coming towards us was this huge orange wall of flame. We went and told our daughters they needed to pack because we had to leave. Now, they had just arrived from England for a 3-week vacation the night before. Our elder daughter, Lucy, always efficient, she had unpacked everything, so she had to pack everything back up, and sadly she left some things behind. But Nikki, who would have taken at least 2 or 3 days to unpack, she just wheeled her suitcase out the front door. Before I left, I looked at the seated Buddha statue, and I asked myself, is there room in the car for him? Where are we going? How long will we be away? I had no answers to these questions, and so I left him, and I totally forgot about the other two. As I was driving down the road, I remembered 2 things I most desperately wanted. One was a knee-height length pair of purple leather boots, which I still miss, and the other was a very sweet pair of blue ankle boots. But there was a voice in my head which said, "Leave them. They are just stuff." 2 days later, we heard that our house had burnt down. And 2 weeks later, we got to come and see if anything was left. When we drove up to where the garage was, at first it seemed there was nothing there. But when we looked closer, we saw the 2 burnt out shells of George's motorbikes and the shell of his truck that he was restoring. We went around the garage to the house, and that's when I saw my two old friends, the washing machine and the dryer, slumped companionably together. We looked through the house, but really there was nothing to save. When we picked something up, it would fall apart in our hands. And so I went out into the backyard, and there on a blackened tree trunk were two woodpeckers, very smart in their black and white plumage with their red hats. And they were laughing and laughing and laughing, as woodpeckers do. This was the first sign of life, the first sound of hope. I looked down at the blackened earth, and staring back at me was the serene face of the Buddha. There were so many cracks in the statue, but we very carefully picked it up, and it didn't break. And we wrapped it in a towel, and we put it safely in our car. And later, when we got a rental house, George cleaned it up and resprayed it, and we have it there. Patricia, you remember my sound healing friend Patricia, she came to visit us. She drove up in a very smart blue rental car, and seated beside her was the Buddha. I said to myself, if I drove around town with the Buddha by my side, I would be such a better person, a better driver. I wouldn't say those awful things I say about my fellow motorists. Now, she explained that she had lost her studio, her casita, her car full of her instruments, but her cottage had been saved by a team from Cal Fire. And this beautiful statue that she had beside her had been saved. It had been in the front yard, but protected by a rock and a tree. And she found on the open hand of the Buddha that one of the firefighters had left a coin, a quarter. And she gifted me this beautiful statue. And now we have it in our house. And one day I walked past the statue and I stopped because I thought, there's something different about it. And when I looked closely, I saw that it was wearing a hat. Not any hat. It was a hat that our daughter Lucy had sent George for Christmas. Well, I was so angry because I thought it was very disrespectful to put a hat on the Buddha. But a voice told me to look closer, not to take the hat off. And as I looked closer, I saw that the Buddha was smiling. I said to myself, why is the Buddha smiling? Is it because the love in the air was thicker than the smoke? Or was the Buddha smiling because through all the heartache, the sadness, the loss, the death, our hearts have been cracked open again and again by love, by compassion? Or was the Buddha smiling because we have suffered a fire change and we are evolving into something both rich and strange? Blessings, abundance, and healing to you all. I got started, officially I think about 25 years ago when my younger daughter wanted to have bedtime stories. But I think throughout all my life, I've been a storyteller, and I grew up amongst storytellers. I grew up in England, where everybody, it seems, wants to tell a story. And I grew up in the countryside, and there were a lot of old characters who remembered Norfolk. This is the county I lived in years ago. Maybe they were in their 70s. And so it was a totally different era that they were telling me stories about. And I was always fascinated by that. And yeah, you always think of the Irish of being storytellers, but the English are good storytellers too.
Right, yeah. So how long have you been telling stories?
I think I've been telling stories to myself pretty much all my life, but I officially started about 25 years ago. And I then took a workshop at Esalen, and that sort of helped me, that sort of put me on the path. And then I decided to find my own voice. So I decided just to tell stories to myself, to friends, and I sort of gradually worked on it. And then maybe 7 years ago, I discovered the Do Tell Story Swap that Kenneth Foster and Elaine Stanley had started. And so it was then I could go each month and hear people tell stories, and I could learn from them. I could learn and see what I liked and also what I didn't like. And it's just been a wonderful school for me. Well, I call them healing stories. They're stories that make you feel better after hearing them. Sometimes they're about a world that's not of our world. You could call it a fantasy world, or it's a parallel world. Or I tell stories, my own personal stories. I think I do have a style. I think it's very much sort of conversational. It's drawing the people in and my audience in. And I've noticed that if I see my audience reacting in some way, like this past weekend, I was telling a certain story and it made some people cry. And so when I see that, I can really get into the story. I can really draw it out. I don't mean to say I play on them crying, but I'm able to sort of match my emotions with them. And I think it makes for a far richer story. So I would say I have a sort of conversational style that people tell me I use a lot of hand gestures, and I use accents that I usually they're British or Irish accents, so it adds a little different flavor. So I think that was Shirley Ann.
Yeah.
So she would be from the north of England. Well, hello there, I'm Shirley Ann. And then where I come from, I often have a character in one of my stories called Old Willem, and he would be an old countryman, and he would go, well, 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 my boy, and how are you today? I think as a listener, storytelling takes you out of yourself, takes you out of your world, and that you can leave that behind. And I think it's very good for us to be able to do this. It's sort of calming, and it shows us that we actually can sort of break free of our fears, our limitations. And for a teller, I think it's very empowering to tell stories. And certainly some stories are stronger than others, but it's a wonderful opportunity and a gift to be able to entertain people, to take them to these places and to have them really appreciate that. It really is a sort of giving and receiving, and I'm always surprised how people are so, how can I say, appreciative of the stories and the telling. It's a beautiful circle. Yes, I think storytelling brings a community together, and that you can understand a lot about people just from the stories they tell, and I think you then understand them a bit better. And I think that's really important, because we do need to stop and listen to our fellow men, women, and yes, so I think it's very, very important that we tell our stories, or we tell other people's stories. No, the good guy nor the good girl doesn't always win, and that's life. I think that's really important. But always they learn something, and this is life. And I think we should have our stories model life in that way. My advice to new or young storytellers would be to really learn the basics, which I think have a beginning, a middle, and end, to have a really good first line, a great finishing line or paragraph. And then what I would suggest is really taking the time to find your own voice. What is your voice? What kind of stories do you want to tell? What do you admire in other storytellers? And really make it your own, because that is the gift, I think, for yourself as a teller and for your listeners. Well, I think storytelling has certainly changed through the ages. I'm sure we all began listening to stories in caves or, drawing in caves, and it's just progressed more and more. And, from perhaps meeting in big groups and hearing things to now getting stories through books, through video, movies, plays, and hopefully really going back to the oral tradition of listening to a storyteller. I mean, it's used in so many different ways, and I personally enjoy the oral story so much better, because when you listen to a good teller, they totally transport you. I mean, you can just be sitting anywhere, but they take you to that land, and that is such a gift. And it's wonderful to know that you can actually yourself do that. You don't have to rely on TV or a movie. That you have your imagination and creativity. I think storytelling could be used to help family dynamics. Would be for people within the family to tell their own story. It really, when you hear somebody's story of where they came from, what happened to them, what they had, what they didn't have, you really begin to understand them. Doesn't mean to say that you like them any better or you like what they did or didn't do, but you get a much, much bigger picture. And I think it would be so helpful for us to practice that. I do have a few favorite storytellers, and first on my list is Elizabeth Ellis, because she is so gifted, and she has I would call it a conversational style. She just sits in a chair and then transports you. She is an absolute master, a mistress of it all, and I've taken a workshop with her, and she is amazing. And I also like, wait a minute, it's just Claire Murphy. She's Irish, and she tells Irish stories, Irish legends, and again, you just go to Ireland, and she's incredibly gifted, and she can sing too, and I think she dances a bit, so she's awesome. And then my other favorite storyteller is Brandon Spars, who I think is incredibly gifted, tells a great story. He sits you down on a roller coaster, and then he starts, and off you go. He takes you with you. Brandon takes you with him wherever he goes on his story, and it is a wild ride, and it's usually highly enjoyable. But also I think like most good storytellers, he's extremely humble, and he's extremely willing to share his craft. And I know there are other storytellers that I like, but these are the three that really spring to my mind. One way I use storytelling is if I can't go to sleep at night, I tell myself a story. And it's absolutely amazing, because sometimes I don't go to sleep as quickly as I could because I'm really in the story. But it's such a gift that you can tell yourself a story at any time. Or if you're traveling, you can look at someone and you can make up a story about them. So it's a gift that you can take with you at anywhere, and it's always available to you. So I'm deeply grateful for the art of storytelling.